Canet here for Woodworkweb, and today I'm going to talk about saw blades. In fact, we're going to run a series of videos on saw blades. Saw blades for your sliding miter, your table saw, your radial arm saw, your chop saw. Those kinds of power tools. You see, when I'm in the hardware stores and the tool stores, I see people purchasing blades, and I know that many of them are really unsure of what they're buying. And so the purpose of this video is to help educate everybody on exactly what you're buying, what to look for when buying saw blades. Like many things in woodworking, there's different qualities of product, and the same is true with saw blades. There's good quality saw blades and there's, well, lesser qualities of saw blades. Now, there's two ways of manufacturing saw blades. The old way of making saw blades that's still used quite readily today is where they have long strips of metal and they literally stamp the blade out of that sheet of metal. A more recent way and a much higher technology way of making blades that allows them to use a harder steel is to actually laser cut the blade out of that sheet of steel. And that's the two manufacturing differences. Now let's have a look at what that means in terms of quality. Okay, let's look first of all at stamped blades. And here's a stamped blade. The first thing you'll notice, if you hit it with a piece of metal, is it rings like a bell. That's a sign that the blade has a resonance to it. And in a good quality blade, you don't want a resonance because it means that it can move going through your wood, which means that you're not going to get a nice, straight, perfectly cut piece of wood. The other thing in a stamp blade that you'll find is the expansion slots. Now you can imagine that a blade heats up in this area, so they build in expansion slots so that the metal has a place to expand into so that it doesn't warp. In a stamped blade you can see an expansion slot that's a slot with a hole, a straight slot with a hole in it. And there you can see there's an expansion slot in a stamped blade. Now the problem with an expansion slot like that, the slot with a hole in it, very often these holes are much bigger than they are in this blade. And those holes can actually howl when you put them in a table saw. That's why you'll see some saws with a little brass divot in there. That brass divot is to reduce the howling that that blade does. We'll see in a minute when a laser cut blade what the expansion slot in that looks like. The other things that you'll find in lower quality blades that you can't really see, typically they will be purchasing carbide off the open market and it will be brazed on with silver solder, and that's pretty standard. You can't tell by looking at carbide whether it's what kind of carbide it is or what kind of quality is. So you just really have to take the manufacturer's word for whatever it is. But that's a stamped blade. You can recognize it by the resonance. And even in a circular saw blade, you can hear that ring like that. And if you touch that blade after you've hit it, you can feel it vibrating, and that's what you don't want to do. Let's look at the difference now in a better quality blade and see what we can find that it has. Okay, so now let's look at some better quality blades. And at Woodworkweb, we make no bones about the fact that we're pretty fond of Freud products. So let's have a look at one of their blades. The first thing that we want to do is do the resonance test. There's a very big difference when you strike a Freud blade. Remember our stamped blade? Now you can do that yourself, there's a very big difference, and the reason that the Freud blade has a much deader sound to it is because they cut in anti-vibration slots to it. These are laser cut blades. They use a harder steel, and that's why they have to laser cut everything into them. So the anti-vibration, if you look closely, let's have a look at the expansion slots in a Freud blade. Okay, there's the expansion slot in a Freud blade. You notice it looks like an upside down question mark, and it's just a very thin line. That expansion slot does the same as it does in the stamp blade. It allows the metal, because this is where the blades heat up in this area here, allows the metal someplace to expand to so that the steel doesn't warp. But there's far more than just the steel that goes into a Freud blade. For example, they're the only manufacturer that we're aware of that actually makes their own carbide, and they actually make 17 different grades of carbide, because the carbide for steel blades and for laminate floor blades and for wood blades all have to have a different grade. The other thing that Freud do when they manufacture their carbide, they actually grind it finer, and that means that your blades stay sharper longer. Now, when you go to purchase Freud blades, they'll either come red or chrome, and they're not, unlike a stamp blade, which is just steel, and you can see how that shines. A chrome blade, you can see how that's more like a mirror. And they either do chrome or this perma-shield, which is very similar to a Teflon type material. Put this on the blades so that it slides through the wood a little bit easier. That makes a big difference on your motors of your saws if the blades actually slide through the wood a little bit easier. In terms of the carbide and fixing it to the blades, in a stamp blade and an inexpensive blade, it'll be brazed on with silver. Freud actually used silver, copper, silver when they braze each tooth to the steel. And the reason they use the copper in the middle is it acts as just a little bit of a buffer so that when that tooth is striking the wood, there's enough of a buffer there that it's easier on the carbide. It's another way of keeping that carbide sharper longer. So when you're buying quality blades, you know some of the features to look for. Now, like all things, there's always a time and a place for the right tool. A stamp blade, you can say, well, where would you use a stamp blade? Well, if you were making a fence and you didn't need a good quality blade, you could use a stamp blade. If you're cutting up pallets for firewood, a stamp blade will work just fine for that. You wouldn't want to ruin one of your good blades. If you're doing fine woodworking and you need good quality cuts, blades that last, and blades that can be resharpened, then you really need to look for quality blades. I'm Colin Canet for Woodworkweb.